The notary stopped mid-sentence and looked at me like I had said something wrong. I hadn't said anything. I was just sitting there holding the folder my aunt had handed me 20 minutes earlier. The one she said contained everything I needed to sign to finalize my mother's estate. The notary, a small man with reading glasses pushed up on his forehead, was looking at the document, then at his computer screen, then back at the document. "Ms. Alderton," he said slowly, "can I ask how you're related to the deceased?" "She was my mother," I said. "Eleanor Alderton. She passed 6 weeks ago." He nodded, but he didn't stamp anything. He typed something, waited, typed again. Then he excused himself and walked to the back of the office and closed the door behind him. I sat in that chair for 11 minutes. I counted. That's the kind of person I am. The kind who counts things when she's nervous, who alphabetizes the spice rack and color codes her calendar and fills silence with numbers, because numbers, at least, don't lie to you. My name is Jillian. I'm 29 years old. I work as a forensic accountant for a mid-sized firm in Cincinnati, Ohio, which means I spend my days looking for the thing that doesn't add up, the figure that's slightly too round, the date that lands on a Sunday. I am very good at finding things that don't belong. It had never occurred to me to look at my own life that way. My mother died in October. Ovarian cancer, 14 months from diagnosis to the end. I had taken leave from work to be with her in the final 2 months, sleeping on the pull-out couch in her apartment, learning how to give injections, watching her get smaller in a way that grief still hasn't let me fully describe. She was 58 years old. She had brown eyes and a dry sense of humor, and she made the best lemon cake I've ever had from a recipe she claimed was her grandmother's. I don't have that recipe anymore. I forgot to ask. My aunt, my mother's younger sister, Constance, had handled most of the paperwork while I handled my mother. That was the arrangement we'd settled into without ever discussing it. Constance was practical and organized and had the kind of energy that expresses grief through action. She made calls. She filed forms. She told me not to worry about any of it. I trusted her. She was the only family I had left. My father had been out of the picture since I was 3. My mother never talked about him except to say that he had made his choice and she had made hers, and that some people are just better at leaving than staying. I'd spent most of my life deciding not to ask follow-up questions about that. The notary came back. He had taken off his reading glasses and was holding them instead, turning them over in his hands. "I need to make a phone call before we proceed," he said. "There's a flag on this property." "What kind of flag?" "A legal encumbrance. It looks like there may be a prior claim." He paused. "I think you should speak with an attorney before you sign anything today." I drove home in a kind of static. I called Constance from the car. She didn't answer. I called again. She didn't answer. I texted. The notary wouldn't complete the paperwork. "There's a flag on Mom's property. What do you know about this?" 3 hours later, she texted back, "I'm sure it's just a clerical error. I'll handle it. Don't worry. I am a forensic accountant. I'll handle it." "Don't worry" is the thing someone says when they are trying very hard to make sure you don't look too closely. I looked closely. It took me 2 evenings and a county property database that was slow and unhelpful and worth every frustrating minute. My mother's apartment, the one she lived in for 19 years, the one where I'd grown up and where she had died, was not titled in her name alone. There was a second name on the deed added in 2019, 4 years before she was diagnosed. The name was Constance Freeland. My aunt. I sat with that for a long time. There was an explanation, I told myself. My mother had added Constance to make things easier in case something happened. That was practical. That was the kind of thing people did. I constructed a version of events where this made complete sense and no one had done anything wrong. And I held that version in my mind for approximately 48 hours before I pulled my mother's financial records and found the second account. It was a savings account in my mother's name, opened in 1994, the year I was born. The beneficiary listed was Jillian Ann Alderton, me. The balance history showed regular deposits over several years, and then, in 2018, a series of withdrawals that left it at 0. The withdrawals had been authorized with a power of attorney, Constance had held my mother's power of attorney since 2016, following a minor health scare that turned out to be nothing. $31,000. Gone. I want to be precise here, because precision is what I have when everything else falls apart. I am not saying I knew then what had happened. I didn't. What I knew was that the math was not adding up. And when the math doesn't add up, there is always a reason. And the reason is never the one that makes you feel better. I went back to basics. When I don't understand a set of numbers, I trace them to their origin. So I traced my mother. Eleanor Alderton had been born in Columbus, Ohio. She had lived there until she was 22. She had worked as a bookkeeper for a small manufacturing firm, taken some accounting classes at a community college, moved to Cincinnati in 1992. That's where the paper trail started to feel strange. Before 1992, she had no credit history, no utility accounts, no lease agreements. Nothing before January of that year. It's not impossible. People rebuild. People start over. But people who start over usually have a reason, and the reason usually leaves some kind of mark. I kept pulling. The Ohio Vital Records Office has a search portal that costs $12 and takes 3 business days. I paid it, mostly because I couldn't sleep and doing something felt better than doing nothing. 3 days later, I had Eleanor Margaret Alderton's birth certificate, except it wasn't my mother's birth certificate. The Eleanor Margaret Alderton, born in Columbus in 1965, had died in 1971 at age 6 from a bacterial infection. I know because I found her death record 20 minutes after I found the birth certificate, and I sat on my kitchen floor with my laptop and my cat, a gray tabby named Footnote, who has no patience for my moods but tolerates them anyway, and I understood, in a very quiet and controlled way, that my mother had not been my mother's real name. I did not panic. I have a process for things I don't know how to feel yet. I write down what I know. I write down what I don't know. I look for the gap between them and I figure out what needs to go in it. What I knew, Eleanor Alderton was an assumed identity, probably taken up sometime around 1992. The woman I'd known as my mother had lived under a name that wasn't hers for at least 31 years. She had died under that name. She had raised me under that name. What I didn't know, who she actually was, what needed to go in the gap, everything. I ordered a DNA kit. Not my first instinct. I am not someone who puts much stock in ancestry websites, but I had no other thread to pull, and a DNA kit was something I could do while I waited for my brain to process the size of what I was looking at. I sent it off and went back to work, because work is what I do when I need to put something in a drawer for a while. 6 weeks later, the results arrived on a Thursday. The ethnicity breakdown matched roughly what I'd expected. Mostly British Isles, some German, a small percentage Scandinavian. But the family matches section was where I stopped breathing for a moment. There was a close match, labeled parent, child, or sibling. The profile name was Hugh Mercer. The account had been created 4 years ago and had one sentence in the bio, looking for a daughter named Alice, born March 9, 1995 in Charleston, South Carolina. My birthday is March 9th. I have never been to Charleston that I know of. I did not message him immediately. I am not someone who moves fast when the stakes are high. I sat with that profile for 6 days, cross-referencing everything I could find publicly. Hugh Mercer, age 61, retired pharmacist, Charleston, SC, married 40 years to a woman named Edith. 1 son, 2 daughters. Or rather, the record suggested he believed he had 2 daughters, but one had been missing since 1995, taken from a hospital nursery when she was 4 days old. A name kept appearing in the news archives I dug up. Alice Mercer. A cold case. There had been coverage in 1995, a smaller follow-up in 2002, and then nothing. The kind of case that doesn't get solved and doesn't quite get forgotten and exists in a family as an open wound that never fully closes. I found a fundraising page Hugh had set up in 2020 for a private investigator's fees. The goal was $4,000. He had raised $847, mostly from people with last names I didn't recognize, and one anonymous donation for $200 that I stared at for a long time. I messaged him on a Sunday evening. I said my name, I said my birthday, I said I had found a close match on the DNA site, and I said I wanted to be careful and thorough because I understood what was at stake if I was wrong. He replied in 4 minutes. Please, he wrote. Whatever you need. I've been waiting 30 years. We spoke on the phone that night. His voice was steady in the way that people are steady when they have practiced being steady for a very long time because the alternative is falling apart and they can't afford to fall apart. He told me about Alice, about Edith coming out of the nursery to find her gone, about the investigation that turned up nothing, about the years of searching that gradually became a lower and lower hum in the background of a life that had to keep going because they had 2 other children who needed them. We always kept the date, he said. March 9th. Every year, no matter what. I had spent my birthdays in Cincinnati eating lemon cake with a woman named Eleanor, who I now understood had been living a life she had taken from someone else. I did not say this to Hugh, I just listened. I requested a clinical DNA test through a lab my firm had used for evidentiary work. A colleague processed the referral. I did not tell anyone what it was for. The sample went out on a Wednesday. While I waited, I kept pulling on the thread. I went back to Constance. I had been avoiding her since the phone call, deflecting with brief texts about estate paperwork timelines. But now, I had a different set of questions. I dug into public records for Constance Reland the way I dig into client files, methodically, without conclusion, just gathering. What I found: Constance had worked as an office manager for a small legal firm in Dayton from 1988 to 1997. The firm specialized in private adoptions. It had been shut down by the Ohio Bar Association in 1998 following an investigation into irregularities in placement documentation. I found my mother's name, Eleanor Alderton, in a 1994 filing related to that firm. Filed as a private custodial arrangement, not a formal adoption. No court supervision, no state oversight. Signed by a notary whose license had lapsed 2 years earlier. The woman who had walked out of a Charleston hospital with someone else's daughter had done it with help, and the person who had helped her had been her sister. The lab results came on a Tuesday. 99.996% probability that Hugh Mercer was my biological father. I sat in my car in the hospital parking garage for a long time. Not the floor of my kitchen this time. I had graduated to my car, which felt like progress. Footnote was not with me, which I counted as a loss. I called my work voicemail and left myself a 3-minute summary of everything I had found in the flat, precise language I use for case notes because I needed to hear it said out loud by a voice I trusted, even if that voice was mine. Then I called an attorney. Her name was Tatum Walsh. A friend from graduate school had used her in an inheritance dispute and described her as someone who reads contracts the way a surgeon reads a body. She knows exactly where it's going to hurt, and she isn't apologetic about it. That was what I needed. I told Tatum everything. She listened the way good attorneys listen, without interruption, without reaction, with a quality of attention that makes you feel the weight of every word you're choosing. When I finished, there was a pause. The custodial arrangement that was filed in 1994, she said. Was there anything in it that specified the origin of the child? It listed me as infant female, born Columbus, Ohio, I said, which is not where I was born. And your Aunt Constance was employed by the firm that filed it, for 6 years before it was shut down. Another pause. The funds withdrawn from the savings account your mother opened in your name, she said. Do you have documentation of the withdrawal authorizations? I have the transaction records. The power of attorney documentation should be on file with the bank. Good. She was quiet for a moment. The statute of limitations on the trust account fraud is 6 years from discovery. You discovered it recently, so that clock is fresh. The custodial fraud is more complicated, but depending on what the original documentation shows, we may be looking at forgery of legal instruments, which doesn't expire cleanly. She paused one more time. And kidnapping, in federal jurisdiction, has no statute of limitations. I was taken from a hospital, I said. Not by my mother, but by whoever she was before she was Eleanor. Your mother walked out of South Carolina with a stolen child and raised her under a false identity, Tatum said. The how and who and why of the taking is a separate matter. The concealment is the matter. 30 years of concealment, with your aunt's assistance, and $31,000 in funds that were yours, diverted through a power of attorney signed by a woman who was living under a false name. She let that sit. That's not a technicality. That's a case. I didn't sleep that night either. I lay in the dark and I thought about my mother, about the way she used to hum slightly off-key when she cooked, about the lemon cake recipe I'd never gotten, about the way she'd held my hand in the hospital at the end and said, "You're going to be fine, Jilly. You've always been fine." Like she was saying something I already knew. I thought about the things she never told me and the things she never let me ask, and the particular silence around my father that had always felt less like grief and more like a door she'd decided to keep locked. I thought about a woman who had done something she could never undo and had spent 30 years living quietly inside that choice, and who had maybe, in her way, loved me, and who had also taken me from people who were lighting a candle for me every March 9th and calling it a birthday they couldn't celebrate and couldn't stop marking. I did not know what to do with all of that. I still don't entirely. But I knew what I had to do next. Tatum moved carefully, which I respected. She reached out to the FBI field office in Cincinnati through a contact she had from a previous case. They, in turn, contacted the Charleston PD, where Alice Mercer's case file had been sitting in a cold case unit for 3 decades. The agent assigned to review it, a woman who called me once to confirm a detail about the 1994 filing and had a voice that sounded like she'd heard everything and was still paying attention, said the case file had never been formally closed. "That's how it works when there's no body," she said. "The family keeps it open." Hugh had never stopped keeping it open. The question of Constance was handled separately. Tatum filed a civil claim for the fraudulent withdrawal from the savings account. The response from Constance's attorney was a letter asserting that the funds had been used for my mother's care and were therefore appropriate expenditures under the power of attorney. Tatum replied with the itemized transaction records, which showed that 7 of the 9 withdrawals had been made before my mother's diagnosis, when she was, by all accounts, healthy and employed and not in need of financial management. Constance called me. I let it go to voicemail. The message was 4 minutes long and contained the word family 11 times. It also contained a phrase, "Your mother wanted this," which I found interesting because my mother had never, in 31 years, mentioned the account or the funds or any arrangement that would justify their disappearance. At the end of the message, Constance said, "I hope you understand that I was protecting you both." And I listened to that sentence 3 times in a row, trying to find the version of events in which it was true. I couldn't find it. I flew to Charleston on a Thursday in February, 6 months after the notary had looked at his screen and excused himself to make a phone call. Hugh and Edith met me at the airport. I had told myself to manage my expectations. I had told myself that meeting biological parents at 29 is complicated, that it doesn't automatically feel like recognition, that awkward and painful and strange are all normal and acceptable outcomes. Hugh was a tall man with gray hair and reading glasses in his shirt pocket and my exact nose, which I had spent 29 years thinking was unremarkable. Edith was smaller than I pictured, with warm eyes and the particular stillness of someone who has learned to hold hope carefully after years of it breaking. They were standing together at the bottom of the escalator, and Hugh was holding a sign that just said, "Alice," in plain black marker, like a question that had been waiting a very long time to become an answer. I stopped a few feet away. I didn't know what to say, so I said the only thing I was sure of: "I'm her." Edith made a sound I don't have a word for. It was not crying exactly. It was something that had been waiting longer than crying. Hugh said, "We know," and his voice broke on the second word, and then we were all just standing there in the arrivals hall of the Charleston airport with people flowing around us and no one quite knowing what to do with their hands. And then Edith opened her arms and I stepped into them. And she smelled like lavender and something baked, and I thought, without quite meaning to, that I had spent my whole life thinking I knew what home felt like, and I'd been wrong. I have a brother named Warren. He is 34 and teaches high school history in Charlotte and sends extremely long text messages with zero punctuation that take me twice as long to parse as they should, and I love them completely. I have a sister named June, a different June than I might have been, the one who grew up with my parents and my name and a space where I was supposed to be. She was careful with me at first. The way you're careful around something fragile. And then one evening, we were on the phone for 2 hours talking about nothing in particular, and somewhere in the middle of that conversation, she said, "You know, Mom's lemon cake recipe is actually from a box mix. Don't tell her," and I laughed so hard I couldn't speak for a moment. And after that, we were fine. Edith does make lemon cake. A real one. From scratch. It is extraordinary. The FBI case is ongoing. The woman who took me from the hospital in 1995, the woman I called my mother for 29 years, died before she could be charged with anything, which is the kind of end that doesn't feel like resolution but has to be accepted as fact. Constance reached a civil settlement for the funds she withdrew. She paid it. We have not spoken since. The case file in Charleston was officially updated in March of this year. I was there when it happened, sitting in a conference room with an FBI agent and a detective who had inherited the case from 3 predecessors and a lawyer who didn't flinch, and Hugh and Edith across the table from me, and a clerk who stamped something and handed a copy to Hugh. And Hugh held it with both hands like it was something that might disappear if he held it wrong. "That's it?" Warren had asked me afterward on the phone. Just a stamp, I said. Anticlimactic. "Most true things are," I said. "There is a photograph." Hugh had it in a box he'd kept for 30 years. A plastic storage bin in the back of his closet that Edith said she had dusted around for decades without ever asking him to get rid of it. Inside the box, the original police report, every follow-up document, printouts from the early internet searches, and at the bottom, a photograph of Edith in a hospital bed, holding a 4-day-old baby with a full head of dark hair and a birthmark on her left wrist. A small oval, rust-colored, distinct. I have that birthmark. I have looked at it my whole life and never thought about it as anything other than a birthmark. The photograph belongs to me now. Hugh asked if I wanted it and I said yes before he finished the question. It sits on my desk next to a photo of Footnote being uncooperative in a coffee mug Warren gave me that says, "History is just gossip that survived." Edith in a hospital gown, exhausted and radiant, holding me like I was something she had been waiting for and was not yet ready to let go. I was not ready to let go either. I just hadn't known it yet. I am still a forensic accountant. I still color code my calendar and alphabetize things when I'm anxious and count things when I'm nervous. Last month, I caught a $400,000 discrepancy in a construction firm's project ledger that turned out to involve 3 people and a set of falsified vendor contracts, and I felt the same quiet satisfaction I always feel when the numbers finally tell me what they've been trying to say. Hugh asked me once if I thought I would have ended up in this work regardless. The finding, the tracing, the understanding that something is always off when the numbers don't align. I thought about it for a while before I answered. "Probably," I said, but it helped that I learned early that things aren't always what they're labeled. He smiled at that, the particular smile of a man who has heard something painful and true and is choosing to hold it gently. I am not going to tell you that I have made peace with everything. I haven't. I loved the woman who raised me, and she lied to me every day of my life. And those 2 things exist in me simultaneously without resolving, and I suspect they always will. Grief is not a problem to be solved. I know that. I am getting better at letting things be unsolved. What I know is this. I am not background noise. I am not a clerical error or an anomaly in someone else's records. I am the figure that didn't match, the date that landed wrong, the account that opened and never quite closed. My name is Alice Jillian Mercer. I am 29 years old, and I have my father's nose and my mother's eyes and a brother who can't punctuate, and a sister who knows the truth about the lemon cake, and a birthmark on my left wrist that was always mine and always meant to be found. I found it. Finally, I found all of it.